Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 13, where we're going to be talking about Rome, picking up where we left off with the 3rd century crisis. Then we're going to talk about how it goes from the era of Constantine, the rise of his domination, and through to the beginnings of the Western collapse. Okay, so here we go. All right, so where we last left off, we were talking about Diocletian and how after a series of chaotic events in the 3rd century, there were barbarian invasions, constant civil war, the currency was in crisis, he comes to power and does everything he can to stabilize things. But that century of chaos had deep repercussions throughout the empire. Not only is it struggling financially to establish stable and reliable economic growth, they're also struggling militarily, and they're struggling to really fulfill their role. If you're talking about the Roman government, the Roman administration, they really struggle to fulfill their role as leaders, as providing actual government leadership on a local level. Now, the Roman government had always been quite small before Diocletian. They really used the army for everything they practically needed to do, almost everything they practically needed to do. So if you wanted to build a road or something, the people building the road were the army, generally speaking. They would hire locals, and they would hire locals to carry out most government functions, everything from running the court system to collecting taxes, anything along the lines that needed to actually be done. But the real direction for that always came from the army. Diocletian is going to change that and create a civilian bureaucracy that creates much more stability. But there were cultural impacts as well during that century, the 3rd century, the 200s, of crisis and chaos. And one of the cultural changes that really started in the 1st century or so AD and expanded really dramatically during that 3rd century was the rise of something called mystery religions. These were very different, though in some ways they had similarities, to the traditional ancient religious cults that you find all over the Roman Empire and the Mediterranean. And in that context, in Greece, in Rome, in North Africa, everywhere that you might travel, except for Judea, where Judaism is the one huge exception, where they have a monotheist religion, pretty much everybody followed the same model we've talked about many times. They have a pantheon of gods. There's a sense that gods are local. And so, therefore, your gods would be the gods that were living in and dedicated to your city, for instance. And so, if you moved, you didn't necessarily keep worshiping the same god. You would worship whoever the local gods were once you got there. And the Romans adopt this without any reservation. When they conquer a new place, they will take images of the god, bring them to Rome, put them up in the pantheon, and be like, these are gods of Rome, too. That's generally the attitude that Romans had. All gods are good. We'll do what we can to kind of collectively keep them happy. And we'll pursue that same kind of ancient pattern where there'll be civic sacrifices made. So either the government pays for it, or sometimes private citizens might pay for it and sponsor it, where you show up, bring food, have the barbecue, sacrifice the thing to the gods. Some of the smoke feeds the gods, pour out libations on the ground, but everybody else gets to have a feast. That's generally the way it worked throughout most of Rome's history and in most of Rome's territory. But from the 1st to the 4th centuries, there are some minority cults, you might say. And in most cases, these are not considered to be in any kind of conflict with civic religion, with the traditional sort of sacrifice-based, everybody shows up for a barbecue day types of religion. It's just kind of a sort of separate ancillary thing that goes on the side. And there are a couple big, very popular cults, but what characterizes them all, and what makes a mystery religion is that they are not this very public, open, everything celebrated in the town square kind of religions. Instead, they focus on a much more personal relationship of the worshiper to the deity. So, in other words, this is something that an individual might choose and dedicate themselves as an individual to the god or goddess that they have decided to dedicate themselves to. And the reason they call it a mystery religion is that this is very often associated with the process of being indoctrinated into secret knowledge or secret teachings that are kept by priests or officiants of this religious sect. And so the person who might want to be dedicated to Isis, for instance, who is the Egyptian goddess, totally unrelated to that unfortunate acronym that has come to have terrible connotations, much to our sorrow. Nevertheless, Isis is a goddess in Egyptian religious practice, and there was a mystery cult for Isis that was very popular from the 1st to the 4th centuries and onward. And if you wanted to be part of that, you had to seek out other members of the cult of Isis, and ask for admission into their club, essentially. And then, if they decided to accept you in, they'd introduce various religious texts and teachings, philosophical discussions, whatnot, and you'd be invited to celebrate privately, just among the sect. But one of the main appeals of this is that the assumption was that once a worshiper had received these secret mysteries, once they'd been indoctrinated, they were therefore now connected to the goddess in a much more universal way. So if they decided to get up and leave wherever they had first attended this sort of temple or cult meeting and go someplace else, so if they traveled from Egypt to Britain, say, they wouldn't give up the worship of Isis. They wouldn't leave her behind, as traditionally would have been done. Instead, the assumption was that as a sort of chosen member, they'd chosen themselves, of her followers, that she would look out for them wherever they went. That was a big feature of these mystery religions. The cult of Mithras was very popular with Roman soldiers, and it makes a lot of sense. If you are living in a community, quite a large community of people who travel a lot, who go from place to place, it is a bit unsatisfying. You can see how it might be a bit unsatisfying to try to constantly have to learn whoever the local gods are, or to kind of live in a situation where you're not feeling connected to gods. And so it makes a lot of sense that a mystery religion like I've described would rise and become quite popular among the Roman soldiers as well. And the cult that becomes popular there is the cult of Mithras. Where it's the same kind of thing. There's initiation rites, there's a lot of like bull symbolism and bloods of bulls, etc., where you'd be indoctrinated and you'd be admitted into the cult of Mithras. And then the assumption was that wherever you went and however you ended up with your life, wherever you were, Mithras would look out for you from there. That's the idea. And you felt a strong personal connection. And these mystery religions, unlike traditional ancient religion, were often associated with ethical and philosophical aspects as well. The idea that Mithras or Isis, or later the most famous mystery religion, we'll get to in just a second, might have sort of requirements for how you behave, how you conduct yourself in life, is a bit different from what we generally find in traditional ancient religious practice, where the gods are usually not all that terribly concerned with your morality on a personal level. They might be offended by terrible, and against nature kind of offenses. So if you're murder your parents or something like that, or violate the laws of hospitality, the gods might become angry and smite you. But generally speaking, they're not watching you to see if you're a good person. That's different with the mystery religions. Okay, so during the 3rd century, there's all this crisis. Nobody knows what's going on. There's this big kind of vacuum when it comes to the practical aspects of leadership. And mystery cults are going to step up and kind of fill that vacuum for a lot of people. They're going to provide guidance. In many cases, they're going to provide social support. And this leads us to arguably the most famous of these mystery cults, Christianity. Now, last time we talked about the very first notice with the Emperor Nero blaming Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, that the Roman government kind of officially made of Christians. And at that time, they were very much considered a weird offshoot of Judaism. And Judaism itself was considered kind of a weird and aberrant religious practice by Roman emperors. But during the 3rd century, Christianity expands slowly but quite dramatically across the Roman Empire. Some of the reason for that is that after and this happened in the 1st century, after the destruction of the Second Temple, after the repression of the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, remember how Titus and then came in and smashed the place up? After that, Jewish populations were scattered across the Roman Empire. and along with them, these early baby tiny Christian communities. And that's roughly around the same time that these Christian communities begin actively trying to recruit people from outside the Jewish population. They start actively trying to recruit people who were just local Roman pagan worshippers like everybody else. The word pagan, by the way, is invented by Christians after the fact. It's nothing anybody would ever have used to describe themselves. It comes from the Greek paganos, which means bumpkin or country dweller. And this gives you some indication of where Christianity is going to take off first. It's really going to be associated with cities and sort of dense populations and people living in kind of cosmopolitan areas, whereas people who lived out in the country were going to worship the old gods, and so they're bumpkins, they're hicks, if you will, is what paganos means, or pagan. Anyway. So, Christianity can be seen as one of these mystery religions. It offers a close kind of personal relationship and connection to a deity, a guidance for how you're supposed to live your life, and on top of that, it was illegal. The Roman Empire decided it was a bad idea and Christians were a bad influence, and so Christianity is not legal, so it has to be practiced in secret, which adds an even extra flavor to this whole mystery religion thing, where you only get in by kind of word of mouth, and you have to seek out the community, and they have this kind of vetting process, and it's all very exclusive. Not really, but nevertheless, you have this kind of secret aspect of it where it's being practiced. But during the 3rd century, when there is all this chaos and no functional government, there's this vacuum of all the sort of practical things government is supposed to provide. And Christianity, even though it's underground and illegal, forms itself in kind of this, well, it's hard to explain what I mean here, but basically they're going to pick up the slack. They're going to create a kind of a grassroots underground organization to try to fill this void where government is not providing the kind of support that people need during this crisis. They're also going to operate in many places around the empire, increasingly in the open. It's technically illegal, Christianity, but for most of the time, between Nero and Diocletian, nobody really is doing anything about it. People are just kind of, it's an open secret. Everybody knows the Christians are there. And when I say they filled the void of government, what I mean is this. They create hierarchies inside the Christian community itself, so that you have people who provide various levels of service and have various levels of influence, from ordinary members to people who might provide sacraments or help to people known as deacons, and a bit of instruction, to people you might later describe as priests who are well educated in Christian doctrine and give lessons and sermons and all that kind of stuff. And then all the way up to bishops who might be the leader of the Christian community in a large sized town or city. And these bishops were in a position where members would make donations and they would raise money, and bishops often had money at their disposal as well as influence in the community. And so if something bad happened in your town, a good example of this would be in North Africa, for instance. In North Africa during the 3rd century, pirates were a major problem, just a huge problem. And one of the things pirates did to make a living, and if you think, well, if you're on the land, why, this is sort of silly. How are you affected by pirates? It's like land sharks or something. But actually, no. One of the things pirates did to make a living was that they would make landfall and grab up anybody they could see just kind of milling around, kidnap them, bring them back to their ships, and then make ransom demands to their families and to their town. They'd be like, hi, we have a bunch of your citizens, town. You either have to pay us a big bunch of money, or we'll just sail away with them and sell them on a slave market somewhere. Either way, we win. And so towns would be in a position where they have to raise up a bunch of money to ransom their people back. And in this moment of crisis, when you can't just call on the emperor to go do something about these horrible pirates and get our people back, people are desperate for anybody who might be able to help out. And so they think about it and like, well, who has some money at their disposal? Who's a good and clever negotiator with some administrative experience? And in many cases, towns where it's quite a minority of people who are Christian might turn to the Christian bishop and ask if the Christian bishop would intercede, if he would go and help help out. And so they do. There's all these records of this happening in places like Alexandria and elsewhere, where Christian bishops would be like, yeah, then there were some pirates, and so we had to go and ransom our people out. And then the town asked if we would ransom everybody, and of course we did. And when there was, barbarian attack, and we were the ones that had to go out and negotiate with the barbarians. Increasingly, this is what happens. In the earliest kind of formulation of this, it would just be Christians looking out for members of their own community. But that is one of the earliest things they do once they begin organizing. They keep lists of widows and orphans and make sure that they're fed and are okay and are not being, victimized by anyone, and generally look out for them. And this is a big part of how Christianity begins to spread, because it's this underground religion. There's a lot of very unsavory rumors about what Christians do and think and believe and are up to, and many aspects of Christian doctrine are deeply unsavory to Romans during this time period. And yet, during the 3rd century crisis, people observe Christian communities actually picking up this slack and taking care first of each other. And then this is how Christianity starts becoming very appealing. If you have a cousin or a friend or a neighbor or something that starts being interested in the Christian community, and the next thing you do is you observe the fact that this person is being cared for by them, or that this person is providing social care for others, then it makes people interested. It makes people sort of warm to the idea of a Christian community, even if they might be slightly weird. And over time, what happens is the Christian communities grow, and they have more and more influence, not just inside their own church, but outside as well. Nevertheless, it's illegal. The church, when I say the church, mostly it's meetings in people's houses. They're not super open about what they're up to. Okay, so Diocletian is therefore not really all that aware of just how far Christianity has spread in the 3rd century. And so during his great push to try to create stability out of the chaos of the 3rd century crisis, it comes to his attention that a Christian has been arrested in the army. Now, this happens every so often. The picture on the left, in case you're wondering why I'm showing you these gruesome pictures, the picture on the left is an image of Saint Sebastian. Now, he wasn't the one that Diocletian noted, but it's the same kind of scenario with him. He was a Roman soldier, and then he has kind of a personal self-examination moment, and he decides that he would like to be a Christian. And in this, he looks at Christian doctrine. And when I told you a second ago that many aspects of Christian doctrine in the first 3 or 4 centuries were deeply unpalatable to Romans, this is an example of that. He looks at Christian teaching in his day, and it seems to imply to him very strongly, and he's supported in this assessment by clergy he knows, that Christians are forbidden to kill other people. And he's like, oh no, that's terrible, because I'm a soldier by profession, and it's kind of in the job description. So if I want to be a Christian, I can't also be a soldier. That's really unfortunate for me, because I'm going to have to tell my commanding officer that I'm leaving to be a Christian. And of course, you're not allowed to just leave the Roman army. Once you've signed up, leaving is desertion, and the penalty for desertion is death. And so he goes and is like, hi, I'm going to have to leave to become a Christian, or I am a Christian, so I'm leaving. However you like to formulate that. And his commander's like, well, you can make that choice if you want, but we're going to shoot you as a deserter. And St. Sebastian's like, well, I guess you'll have to do what you have to do then. So they line him up in front of a firing squad. And of course, a firing squad in the ancient world is arrows. And they shoot him full of arrows, and miraculously, he doesn't die. This is the story of St. Sebastian. He's just all full of arrows. But they're like, okay, well, we shot you, I guess. We'll just leave you for dead and go away then. Bye. And he recovers. And goes on, and he goes telling everybody about his decision to be a Christian and his miraculous escape. Eventually, he's being arrested because of Christianity is illegal, and he is, in fact, executed. He's declared a martyr. We'll get to what that means in just a second, and is sort of celebrated, and paintings are painted about him in the Renaissance, like this one by Andrea Mantegna, which you can see here. Anyway, so this is kind of the situation of Christianity. It's spread quite a lot. And a case like St. Sebastian's comes to Diocletian's attention, and he's shocked. He's like, There are Christians in the army? You're kidding me. It was shocking to him because for many people in his social class, the only thing they'd heard of with Christians are some of the more lurid rumors that were going around. Now, these are based in some cases in sort of obvious distortions of the fact. Remember that Christianity is illegal, and so their actual practices have to be somewhat secret. So they meet in places like catacombs, or which is like basically an underground burial area, where they can kind of get together and it's a secret place, or they meet in people's houses and back rooms. And early Christian communities often referred to these meetings where they would celebrate and discuss and generally perform rituals associated with Christianity as love feasts. And they meant that in the sort of brotherly love, we care for one another kind of way. But both men and women would attend. And so one of the rumors that goes around Rome is that these Christians are getting together for orgies and not inviting us. That's one of the rumors that were out there. Some of the worst rumors had to do with further distortions of Christian practice. One of the most famous of which is that during these love feasts, early Christian communities would often reenact the Last Supper of Jesus, where he would got together with his apostles, and then told them that held up bread and said, "This is my body, and everyone will eat it, and we'll all be one family. And this is my blood." And so this would be, hold up wine and say, "This is my blood." And so most people at the time understood this to be symbolic. There's going to be a little bit of a tricky situation with transubstantiation theory later. But nevertheless, when Christians got together to reenact this, they're using bread and wine. They're not eating people. But if you can imagine getting kind of a half story, a rumor that circulates around that Christians are up to this in their secret meetings, they're eating bodies and blood of people. This, you can imagine where imaginations go with that. They're like, Christians are cannibals? They're having these secret meetings in tombs to eat people? And of course, the rumors go crazy. Christians mess with dead bodies. Christians are, and this is the sort of standard accusation you always make if you think people are creepy. Christians are eating babies. Because, of course, you look around and you're like, well, people aren't really going missing in our community. If Christians are eating them, what people do they have access to? And the theory goes, well, they must be having babies in order to eat them, stealing babies, sacrificing babies, eating babies. This is one of the things that gets circulated around. And in addition to these wild rumors, there's also a sort of a distaste for a lot of what the Christian community was actively preaching. For one, you had a number of Christians during these first 4 centuries who really thought that it meant you had to be a complete pacifist, that you couldn't be a soldier, that you couldn't actually engage in fighting. Now, if you're a Roman emperor trying to keep a Roman army together, this is considered very dangerous ideology. You don't want your soldiers to just desert. That would be terrible. There's also a great deal and we'll talk about this in our discussion of Perpetua this week. There's a great number of Christian thinkers who argue strongly that it's more important to attend to your spiritual needs than to look out for the sort of cultural traditions that exist in Rome. So if it means you have to disobey your parents, for instance, to go off and become a Christian, you should do that. And that's deeply offensive to the Roman sensibility. Remember the pater familias, the father of the family. The assumption is, of course, that your children would respect you and do as you say for their entire lives. That was what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to honor your parents. In addition to that, there's a strong feeling in the Christian community that the end is coming soon, that Jesus is on his way back, and there's no point in planning for the future. And further, many Christian communities kind of get enmeshed with a Neoplatonic philosophy. If you remember Plato from way back in the day, he argues that there's a distinction between the physical and the spiritual, and that the spiritual is infinitely superior. Well, many early Christian communities kind of adopt that and twist it just a little bit to say basically that you should turn your back on the physical world, anything that has to do with material wealth or comfort or sex or having children is all at the very least not as good as dedicating yourself to pure spirituality, and in some cases is actively bad. It's dragging you away from your spiritual goals. And so don't get married, don't have kids, give away all your wealth, and don't listen to your parents. You can imagine how Roman emperors and parents and generally conservative people felt about this. They were horrified. They're like, these Christians are crazy, and we want no part of them, and they're a terrible influence, and we don't like them at all. So Diocletian hears there's Christians in the army, and he's like, oh, when did this happen? How many of them are there? And I want some kind of investigation. And so he looks into it a bit, and he finds out that in this period of crisis of the 3rd century, Christianity has spread its tentacles. They're all over the place. And he finds out they're everywhere. And he's like, oh, no, they're everywhere. We've got to do something about this. I'm not having it. We're going to go back to the way things used to be in Rome, where we didn't have Christians. So he gives orders for the Great Persecution. From 303 to 313 is when it's carried out. Now, here's the deal with the Great Persecution. This is how it works. Diocletian considered himself to be extremely reasonable about this. You're not allowed to be Christian, full stop. He's not tolerating it. But how will he stop people? Here's his plan. He basically goes from town to town, having commissioned kind of a special investigation to look into this. And he makes inquiries. And he's like, does anybody know of any Christians in town? And then neighbors will come and inform on the Christian community. So the neighbors will go and inform, and he'll find out that there's a Christian church. Then soldiers will be dispatched to that church. And when I say church, it's mostly people's houses. Will be dispatched to that house where meetings are being held. And the soldiers will then demand to know whether there are Christians present. If there are Christians present, they will be put under arrest, and demands will be made that those Christians turn over any sacred texts they might have, and any other kind of ritual objects they might have hanging around the house. Turn those over, and we will destroy them, burn them up, wreck them, that kind of thing. And then you arrest those that we've just arrested you. We're going to drag on down to prison. And they take the arrested down to the prison, and then they are called up in front of a judge. And the judge says, hey, are you Christian? Because that's illegal. And Christians have now an option. If they say, no, I'm not a Christian, or even if they say, yes, I am a Christian, but I'm willing to stop doing that now, and I'm sorry, and I won't do it again, then the judge says, well, all right then, if you're not a Christian, or if you're willing to stop being a Christian, I've got a little image of the emperor here. I want you to burn a little incense in front of it, say a little prayer for the sort of health, well-being, and success of the emperor's spirit, and then you can go. That literally is it. If you're willing to do that, bye. You are dismissed. If, however, you really believe, if you feel that you are a Christian, and that as part of being part of a monotheistic sect, doing this would compromise your immortal soul, this would be a betrayal of everything that is important to you. If you're a serious Christian, you can't do it. And so if you refuse, if you say, yes, I'm a Christian, I'm not willing to give that up, I'm not going to burn incense in front of the image of the emperor, I'm just going to be a Christian, that's it. I know it's against the law, so be it. Then the judge is like, well, we're going to execute you. And the judge will then attempt to talk the Christian out of being punished. If they insist, they're sometimes tortured a bit, often just kind of thrown in prison, and then ultimately executed. When Romans execute people, they do it publicly and make a big spectacle of it. They often raise this to kind of a high art. There's usually a bit of irony involved, where if you have committed a crime, they'll try to execute you in some kind of gruesome, horrible way that echoes that crime. So you have this, you worship a carpenter, you end up dead with a wood saw. Possibly this is St. Cyriacus there. They also will throw Christians to be destroyed by the beasts. This is the leopard eating the man's face off party right there. In any case, they're put out in the public arena and executed. You can see from this image here, this is, it's actually from the earlier persecution of an emperor named Decian in 250 or so. It was a much smaller scale. This is what's known as a libellus. So how do you find out who's a Christian? Well, here's the thing. Either they were hanging around and you arrested them, or under torture, or perhaps just to save themselves, or because you're a neighbor and you're annoyed about them, you might write down the names of people who are members of this Christian community. If you get named, you may be arrested. If you get caught on the scene when the church is seized, you may be arrested. In any case, most Christians are not arrested. They're going to run off into the hills and hide for a few days, and the persecution is just kind of going to pass them over. In many instances, the only people who get arrested are people who kind of make a point of being in the way of arresting officers. They're almost volunteers. And then they're executed in gruesome ways. And there's this whole very odd, but there's this whole kind of religious cultural movement where Christians who have been arrested kind of take pride in and go out of their way to demonstrate that they are voluntarily going to these gruesome deaths, that they have chosen this, that they're being made into a public spectacle because they refuse to compromise their beliefs. And in a odd, maybe it's not odd way, this has almost the opposite of effect of what Romans were going for when they decided to publicly execute Christians. What Diocletian wanted was to eliminate Christianity. That's what he was hoping for. He's not going to succeed for a couple of major reasons. One is that Christianity there's no point in shutting the barn door now. It's out there. There's lots and lots of Christians. Two, those Christians are providing what is considered by even non-Christians as valuable public service in their communities. They're taking care of widows and orphans. They're negotiating with pirates. They're doing stuff. And it's hard to root them out. And almost everybody knows a Christian at some point, or somebody knows somebody who knows somebody. It's difficult to get rid of that fully through violent means. And then, third, Diocletian thought of himself as being incredibly reasonable and generous, so this way he'll avoid offending the general public by executing people for religious beliefs if he just gives them the option to stop being so weird, in his view. It backfires, though, because Romans have this kind of love obsession thing with gladiators. Remember how the gladiators are kind of odd figures? They're sports heroes, but at the same time they have very low status. They're often slaves. So it's this kind of paradoxical figure. Well, the Christian martyrs are going to take that idea and run with it. They're going to march out into the arena to be executed and make it crystal clear that this is voluntary, that they've chosen this, that yes, they're going to be humiliated in arguably the worst way possible, but in fact, they don't see that as humiliation, but rather as they themselves witnessing to the depth of their devotion. And this is deeply moving to a Roman audience that is already primed for it. They've already been sitting with this idea of the gladiator who, in his sort of humiliation, he's made a public spectacle of. It nevertheless triumphs over that humiliation to create an image of himself as a kind of glorious fighter, fighting nobly, etc., and redeeming this kind of essentially compromise of his dignity. So they're already kind of set for this and ready for it. And what the public execution on a large scale of Christians actually does is it introduces a lot of people in Roman culture, society, and towns to Christianity in a way they otherwise might not have been. It makes Christianity much more visible, and it creates a whole lot of questions in people's minds who might not have had questions otherwise. They see people marching out voluntarily to die in often gruesome and horrific ways, and they think to themselves, well, why? What is so good that could possibly move people to do this? Why? What is this all about? And so it backfires. Instead of eliminating Christianity, it only makes it dig in more deeply. So It also encourages something that we'll refer to as the cult of the martyrs, people who are executed, and they will always be the minority of the Christian population. Most Christians are not willing to do this. They will take one of a couple options. They may be arrested and chicken out. They'll burn the incense and get released. They may, more likely, simply avoid getting arrested when the persecution comes to town. That's what most Christians are going to do. Those who do get arrested and actually are executed for their faith will be hailed as something called martyrs. It's Greek, it means witness. And something called the cult of the martyrs will spring up as a result of this, where Christians will begin venerating these people who have died for their faith, believing that the fact that they were able to do this, that they were able to hold strong, because at any point, the people who are executed for being Christians can chicken out. They can simply change their mind and be like, I'm sorry, I'll stop being a Christian. And the emperor will release them. That's the deal. You're done. They'll just let you go. But they don't. And so the fact that they have chosen this kind of death was seen by many people in the Christian community as miracles, as miraculous, that they were able to triumph over their physical needs in such a way that they were willing to die for their faith. And so therefore, the martyrs themselves are venerated. Stories about their lives and their deaths will be written down and circulated all over. They sell like hotcakes. Everybody has copies. They read them. They study them. It's a big deal. The bodies themselves of people who have been executed for being Christians are also venerated, where they'll be kind of reliquaries, where body parts or complete bodies of people will be preserved, and then people will go and like offer offerings to the shrine of that person, or say prayers to that person, or ask that person for intercession, becomes a very popular thing to do. And so you have this cult of the martyrs. People are very interested in them. They're kind of idealizing them and holding them up as heroes. You also have, this is just kind of a side note, a bit of pushback. There's a great number of people in Roman towns and society that think this whole Christianity thing is just awful. This is a piece of graffiti that was inscribed on a Roman wall. You can see that all the way over there on the left. It says, Alexamenos is worshiping his god. They're in Greece. I mean, it's Greek anyway. And you can see there's this meant to be very rude drawing of a Christian who is worshiping a man crucified with the head of a donkey. Oh, there you go. From Rome. So Christianity is odd. It's in this odd position. It's illegal, and Christians are going underground and have been underground, but they're being driven further underground. But their organization is already set. It doesn't go anywhere. You find these little kind of secret symbols all over the place. When Christians die, they often want to indicate epitaphs, leaving basically a tombstone behind yourself that describes your life and your name and where you're from and all that kind of thing. Is very, very, very popular Roman custom. And Christians who die like to give some indication on their epitaphs that they were Christian. Sometimes they straight out say it, but often they're a little bit too chicken. So they'll put symbols on that are supposed to give the clue. The one you have in the middle here, you see those fish? You find this fish symbol, and that's, if you've ever seen that like weird fish on the back of people's cars, it's the Ichthus fish, and it's from the sort of Greek-speaking part of the Roman world, because the word for fish in Greece is Ichthus, and this was held as an acronym, so it's kind of a secret code. Jesus Christus Theo Iou Soter, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. And so if you see the fish, you're like, Christian, I know it's you. There are other symbols as well, which we'll talk about a bit later, that are meant to be kind of a secret clue. So if you see one on a house, you're like, secret Christian church here. That's how you know to like go there if you're a Christian or you'd like to be a Christian. So anyway, Christians don't go anywhere. They're worshiping, they're not worshiping, but it's a fine line. They're venerating martyrs. There's some pushback in Roman society. All that stuff is happening. Okay, so now on to the political side. the empire has been divided. Diocletian is attempting to stabilize what had been a constant source of civil war. The empire's too big, so he splits it into east and west purely for administrative purposes. He doesn't really see this as creating two empires. He just sees this as kind of a governmental necessity. And so there's an emperor called an Augustus in the east and an emperor called the Augustus in the west. They both have command of armies, and their job is to keep the peace and keep the empire together. And so Diocletian is himself going to claim the east. He's going to put the west in the hands of a guy named Maximian. Then Diocletian is going to divide the empire even further and create a junior emperor for each side called a Caesar. And the first two Caesars are guys named Galerius and Constantius. Now, I'm not going to get into all the detail of all the personnel, not least of which because there's going to be a Maxentius, a Maximinus, and a Maximian kind of all at the same time, and it just ends up becoming word salad. So what I need you to remember about this situation with the Tetrarchy is that when the Caesar dies, if the Caesar happens to die, what's supposed to happen is that the Augustus, the chief emperor, is supposed to name a new Caesar. And the idea being that when the chief emperor dies, if he dies or retires, as Diocletian does, he leaves for estates in the Black Sea, if the emperor is out of the way, if the Augustus is out of the way, then the Caesar moves up and appoints a new Caesar. That's how it's supposed to work. Well, that's not how it works in the West. Constantius dies, and his troops immediately proclaim his son, Constantine, to be the new Caesar. Now, the Augustus, Maximian, wasn't really all that happy with this, but it ended up becoming an issue of force. And this fella, Constantine, is going to use the support of his troops in order to press his claim. He's not going to step down no matter how the Tetrarchy is supposed to work. Instead, he's going to stand up for himself and demand that he be proclaimed emperor. And he's going to go into a series of wars where he fights those 3M guys, and including a guy named Galerius too. So in addition to Maximian, Maxentius, and Maximinus, there will also be a Galerius. He's going to end up fighting them all. I'm not going to get into all the details of exactly how that plays out. One of them, Maxentius, is going to start the whole thing with a rebellion, and then Constantine's going to take him out and defeat him. And it's going to be a big, nasty series of fights. And one of the most crucial battles, and this is significant and worth remembering for the purposes of taking a final, for instance. One of the chief battles in this civil strife that established Constantine was known as the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. It takes place in Italy as Constantine is attempting to crush the claims of a fellow by the name of Maxentius. And it's on the eve of battle, Constantine is having a moment. He's outnumbered. He's had a good look at the troop reports. He does have command of those Western legions. They're awfully tough, even now. And so he maybe has a little bit of an advantage there. But it looks like it's the evening of doom and gloom. He's most likely going to lose this battle and lose control over the West. But in the middle of his sleep, he has a dream. This is all comes to us from a Christian writer later by the name of Eusebius, who writes this all down. He has this dream where a vision appears to him. A circle with an X and a funny-looking little P. If you see those panels below, that relief sculpture, if you look in the middle where there's that wreath thing, that's what I mean. This is called the chi rho. That X is the Greek letter chi, and that kind of odd little P that goes through the middle of it, that's the Greek letter rho. And so he wakes up because he hears in this dream, he sees this symbol glowing, and a voice, disembodied voice, tells him, "In this sign you shall conquer." So he wakes up and he calls for advisors, and he's like, this is what I saw. It's this symbol. He draws it out, and I heard that I would conquer in this sign. Now, dream prophecy was taken very, very seriously in the Roman Empire, and his advisors, according to Eusebius, just by coincidence, happened to be Christian. And so they see this, and they're like, ha, that's one of those secret code symbols for Christians, that Chi and Rho are the first two letters of Christos, and so Christians would put that Chi Rho symbol on things to indicate that this was a place where there were Christian churches, or that that person was Christian, or something like that. So they tell him, ha, this is actually the symbol of the Christian God. And Constantine, according to Eusebius, had no idea and asks them to explain what that is all about. And so they do. They advise him, and he's like, oh, well, that sounds good, I guess. I will adopt this then. And so he has that painted on shields and put on a banner, and he goes into battle against Maxentius, and he triumphs, even though the odds were against him. And so afterwards, he comes out of this experience, and he decides that Christianity maybe isn't so bad. It's technically illegal in the empire, but perhaps he can start to loosen those restrictions and accept Christianity. Now, I want to point out a couple of flaws in Eusebius's account here. Number one, even though Christianity is illegal, Constantine's advisors just so happen to include people who are actively Christian. Eusebius implies he didn't know that. I think that's highly unlikely. It's also highly unlikely that Constantine didn't know anything about this, because many signs and indications suggest that his mother, Helena, was actively Christian. So it's not likely that he was perhaps just as innocent as Eusebius would imply. I don't even know for certain whether this whole dream thing actually happened. It was reported during his lifetime, and he never contradicted it. But there you go. That's the legend of how Constantine decided that Christianity might be okay. The next year, in 313 AD, he issues something called the Edict of Milan. Once he's consolidated his control over the western part of the Roman Empire, which he does by virtue of that battle at the Milvian Bridge, he is going to pass a law that basically says it is now legal to be Christian. He doesn't make Christianity the official religion of Rome. That would be impractical. Most people are not Christian, have no interest in being Christian. It's not anything like even a large minority of people. It's growing, but it's not, they're just not in significant enough numbers. But he does say that if you'd like to be Christian, you may, and there will be no penalty, no more persecutions of Christians. In fact, he donates money to Christian churches and Christian clergy. After all, Christians are the ones who are providing those social services. It's the closest thing. Now, the Roman government never really had been in the business of providing charity to people, but the Christian church already has been doing that for years and years, and Constantine sees this as an excellent opportunity. If he gives a bunch of money to bishops, then those bishops can spread it around to the people who need it the most. Widows and orphans and people like that. He donates money to them. He restores land and property that had been seized during the persecution and allows them to rebuild. He promotes Christians who are openly Christian into political public offices. And he recognizes the authority, this is possibly the most important bit, of church courts. Now, this has been something that had been going on the down low for years. When Christians got into a dispute with each other, one of the options that they had been doing was that they would have the bishop or a church official mediate their disputes rather than going through the official Roman court system. Remember in the 3rd century, that years of the 200s when everything is chaotic? Well, the Roman courts were not exempt from the kind of struggles that were happening during that time period, and so they were incredibly unwieldy. It took them forever to hear cases. They were definitely prone to bribery and corruption. They were places where ordinary people had a hard time getting a fair shake. And so if the two parties who were in a dispute were both Christian, it made more sense to them to go to their bishop and ask their bishop to make decisions about who was right and who was wrong, about whose goat was whose, where the property boundary was. And This was only encouraged by the fact that the high clergy of the Christian church, priests and bishops and so forth, often were quite well educated. They could read and write well, and so they kept records for people, not just lists of widows and orphans, but if you wanted a deed of sale recorded or kept safe in a safe kind of repository, you might go to your bishop to do that for you. And so it became a kind of a governmental function. They were the kind of place you went for to hear disputes heard. They were the place you went to have your records kept and reviewed, that kind of thing. So what Constantine does is he basically says, not only is that okay with me, I'm going to give you money, I'm going to give you support, and I'm going to give you an official governmental rubber stamp. Whatever you decide in your church court will be the legal decision. So initially, they were only allowed to hear disputes between two Christian parties. Eventually, only one party had to be Christian in order to go to the church court. And going to church courts was quite popular because of their general lack, I mean, not to say they were always not corrupt, but general lack of corruption and not as much bribery needed, etc. And so what Constantine effectively does is he creates a very functional branch of government without having to actually run or design it himself. He just kind of co-ops what the Christians were doing and uses it to bolster and increase his own influence. Okay, but then he finds out something he's really upset and disturbed by. The First Council of Nicaea comes about because Constantine assumed when he took over power, when he starts giving money to Christian churches, that they were all the same, or all at least on the same team, that they all got along with each other, that the hierarchy they kind of worked out amongst themselves, that this applied smoothly right across the empire. But he's quite wrong. While it's illegal, Christian churches can only be so loud about who they are and what they're doing. Any disputes they might have to be kept quiet. That being said, disputes are rife throughout Christian communities, inside them, between Christian communities in different towns in some cases, and because it was illegal, that hierarchy, that administration within the church, as clear as it was in some cases, got really muddy in others, where everybody kind of acknowledged that the bishop of a big town like Nicaea would have, I guess, preeminence, or would be a person who had more authority than, say, a priest from the backwoods of someplace, and certainly a priest in the town of Nicaea. But if Nicaea got into a dispute with, I don't know, let's pick a town. If they got into a dispute with Athens or something, then it wasn't really clear which of them outranked the other. And this goes right to the tippy top of Christian kind of hierarchy, which would be the bishops who were in charge of what were known as the apostolic sees. We'll get back around to that later in lecture. But basically what you need to remember is that there's no one really clearly, no single person in charge of the Christian church. There isn't even one clear Christian church. There are a number of groups who have all gotten into disputes with each other. Sometimes these have to do with theology. Some of them argue about the nature of Jesus. Is he a God? Is he a man? Is he a God-man? What's the deal with Jesus? And if they can't reconcile their differences, the community splits and there'll be a schism and there'll be two communities. There was a major schism in North Africa resulting from the Great Persecution. Some people who got arrested for the Great Persecution were brave and ended up as martyrs. Other people got arrested during the Great Persecution and they chickened out and they recanted. They're like, I won't be a Christian anymore. But then they left and decided, I'm really sorry I did that. I didn't mean it. I did it to save my life, but I really would like to go on being a Christian. Even some relatively high clergy did this. People who were bishops, people who were priests, who'd been baptizing people, for instance. They either betrayed Christianity and left it, or they, took the oath and were dismissed. They swore, basically they backed out. They betrayed their own faith, as it was perceived by some other members of their community. And so there was this dispute in North Africa over whether those people could be let back in. Once you've been arrested and you deny that you're a Christian or will be a Christian in the future, once you've turned your back on it, should you be let back in? And there were hardcore people who were like, no, they should not be let back in. And any baptisms or whatever they performed should be redone. Those are known as Donatists. And then there were people who were more mainstream. They're like, no, people make mistakes. You have to just allow for that and forgive them their human frailty and just make it up. And baptism isn't really all about how good a person is who does the baptizing. It's God that baptizes you and so forth. And there's a whole dispute about it. But because of this dispute, there were two communities in towns like Alexandria. It was a big Christian communities there, and they were actively fighting each other in 324. They would get into literal battles in the street. There were two bishops. Nobody was really clear on which one was the real, like the official bishop. It was a mess. And so this is just one of many disputes like that across the empire. And Constantine finds out about it and he's like, oh no. Oh, I wanted to beg the Christians to make my life easier, not this. This is terrible. Meanwhile, he sweeps through the rest of his opposition. He's going to take over all of the Roman Empire. He's going to rule it kind of all in one. And he's like, you know what? I want to back the Christians, but we have to straighten out who's a Christian and who's not. Who's going to get the money? Who's going to get my official recognition? So he summons what's known as the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, 324. Everyone who's a Christian bishop or a Christian clergy person is invited to attend, and thousands do. So they all come swooping on in, hundreds do at least, come swooping on into Nicaea, sit down, and there's basically big debates over various points of faith. What is it that Christians believe? And they sit down and they argue about it and they hammer it out and they come to a formulation which is known as the Nicene Creed. Presiding over all of this is Constantine. That's him in the middle of the picture there. Constantine is not a Christian. He hasn't been baptized. He hasn't forsworn the Roman gods. He's just kind of there. He assumes that he should be in charge of this process because he's the emperor. This notion is something called Cesaro Papism. That's on your lecture sheet, so you should check that out. Cesaro Papism is the idea and because he's the emperor, he ought to be in charge of the church, of any religious function. This goes right back to Julius Caesar and Augustus, where because they were in charge of the government, they wanted to be Pontifex Maximus. They naturally assumed they'd also be in charge of religious observance. This was the assumption in the early years of the legalization of Christianity, that the emperor naturally would assume a role in running the church, even when it came down to determining what it is that Christians believe, even in the case of Constantine, when he's not even officially a Christian at this point. He does convert and is baptized on his deathbed, but nevertheless, that is going to be years from now. So he creates it. He calls the council. He presides over the council. The council hammers out points of Christian doctrine, and Constantine makes a decision that is going to ultimately alter Christianity in a massive and irreversible way. He puts the rubber stamp of government on the Nicene Creed. And he says, all right, as emperor, I have decreed that these people who sign on to this and are part of this team are Christians. And anybody who won't, if they disagree with the structure of the Trinity as it's laid out in the Nicene Creed, for instance, if you decide you cannot get along with them and you end up excommunicated, so you're not talking to them anymore, then you are officially outside the imperially recognized Christian church, the Catholic Church. That's what it becomes to be known as. Catholic just is a Greek word meaning universal. He is like, so if you're not in the universal church, the church for everyone, then you're a heretic. Sorry, but that's just how it is. You don't get any money. And then later, things escalate so that people who get labeled heretics, not only do they not get any money, but they could be persecuted as well, arrested and generally punished. They're cast out. They don't get imperial recognition. They don't get any money. And possibly later, they could end up in trouble where they could be arrested and otherwise had problems caused for them. Okay, that's not always consistent. Now, what does this do to the Christian churches? What does this do to Christianity as a religious and social movement? Well, you can see some, I guess, lovely visual cues just from the art that starts popping up around this time. being given imperial authority, imperial recognition, is going to fundamentally change the complexion of Christian leadership and ultimately the Christian church. All of the things that Romans really found distasteful about Christianity, that whole ignore your parents, give away your wealth, don't get married, don't have children, they don't entirely go away, but they begin softening a lot and relatively rapidly. So people who are being promoted inside the Christian church start looking a lot more like traditional Romans than they did before. It's one of those kind of ironies that when people in, say, the US today talk about traditional Christian family values, they're in fact not talking about Christian family values. They're talking about Roman family values. Get married, have lots of kids, listen to your parents, that kind of thing, obey the government. Early Christians did none of that. They were very radical and considered very weird and dangerous. But you can see how that image begins to change. On the left, what you have here is an image of the Good Shepherd. It's one of the earliest examples of Christian art. It's from a catacomb, one of those tombs that's underground, of a person named Priscilla. And dates from about 250 to 300 AD, before Christianity is legalized. And that's an image of Jesus there. He doesn't have the halo. That wasn't standard practice at this time. But he's surrounded by animals. You've got birds that might perhaps be supposed to be doves above him. He's got sheep around him. That might be a goat there on the right. But basically, he's a shepherd. He's got the sheep on his shoulders. He's got a very plain outfit on, as a shepherd might wear. He's depicted as a young man, peaceful, surrounded by nature. Very typical of what you find in very early Christian art. On the right, you have an extreme example of how this begins to change. That's an example of gold mosaic. It comes from a church in Ravenna. We'll talk about Ravenna in just a second. It comes from a church in Ravenna, a city in Italy, and it is a process of creating images where tiny pieces of colored glass are stuck onto a surface, either the floor or the wall or someplace. And you make a picture with these tiny pieces of glass or ceramic. And the reason it's called gold mosaic is because all that kind of like golden brown color in the background and on the outfit and the line, etc., all that stuff would be created often by taking pieces of glass, translucent or transparent tiny pieces of glass, and then covering the back of them with gold foil and then sticking that on the wall. And the effect of this is that when the light hits a piece of gold mosaic like this, it shimmers and glows and looks really cool. And as you can imagine, it's very expensive to produce a piece of art like this. So this is an officially sanctioned piece of art. You can tell this is an image of Jesus for two reasons. One, he's got that halo with the cross in it behind his head. That becomes a convention, an artistic convention that indicates you're looking at Jesus. And rather than being surrounded by sheep and dressed like a shepherd, you see this figure. He's also a young man, but he's standing on a lion and a snake, somewhat awkwardly. And he's got a book in his hand. This is the other clue that it's Jesus, because it says, Ego sum via veritas et vita, which is, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So that's another clue. It's Jesus you're looking at. But check out his outfit. He's dressed not as a shepherd, but as a Roman soldier. And that cross that he's got over his shoulders, showing the cross to remind everyone how Jesus got crucified, was very common in Christian art. That's not so much a crucifix as it is perhaps a sword. It doesn't really look like a sword that much either, but it deliberately is supposed to kind of blur that line to invoke the crucifix but look like a sword. And then also, he's standing on a lion and a snake. The serpent is very traditional imagery to indicate kind of sinfulness and worldliness and general bad behavior. And the lion, however, the lion is traditional symbolism as well. Lions indicate and symbolize political power. They symbolize royalty. They symbolize that kind of worldly power. And so this Christian image is a completely different kettle of fish. Here, the image of Christ isn't the simple, plain shepherd, humble person advocating peace. This is an image of Christ as a soldier, a Christ as a triumphant soldier who has not only vanquished sinfulness, but has vanquished political might as well. He's sitting on top of the world. Okay. And then the ultimate expression of that is this, which becomes quite popular. And another example of gold mosaic. This one you can see how it's a little shiny. This is Jesus again. And you can tell he's got the cross behind his head and the halo. He's offering a benediction. That's what that hand with the couple of fingers sticking up is, a blessing for people who might be standing in front of him. But between his outfit and his position, he's sitting on a throne. And he's dressed not just as a Roman soldier in this case, he's dressed as a Roman emperor. And he's offering us a blessing, and he's attended by angels, just the way that the court of the emperor would be attended by his advisors and etc., people like that, to the side of him. And this again is from Ravenna from the 6th century. This formulation where Jesus is pictured enthroned, dressed as an emperor and attended by a court, is referred to as Christus in Majestas. It's so popular that we have a name for this style of depiction, Christ in Majesty. And this becomes popular in pieces that the emperor or somebody close to him, kings, etc., have commissioned. And it gives you some insight into how imperial favor transforms the church. It's not that images of the Good Shepherd ever entirely disappear, but images of Jesus end up being very much blurred in pieces of artwork that are commissioned by the emperors, where the line between the emperor and Jesus is deliberately confusing. Jesus looks like an emperor. The implication is that the emperor is somewhat like Jesus. This is a monotheist sort of system with a trinity, so it's one God in 3 persons. It's quite complicated, but nevertheless, the not very subtle implication is that if the emperor and Jesus are kind of almost sort of the same thing, well then obviously if you would be loyal to and worshipful of Jesus, you should transfer that kind of feeling over to the position of the emperor. It's his divinely appointed right to rule over you in triumph and bring Christianity everywhere, and we're all going to be together, one big happy family, and it's going to be great for everyone. It's probably not the greatest leap of imagination to understand why an emperor would want you to think of him that way. So you have this image as well. And in every level, before I move on, I suppose I should emphasize at every level of Christian administration, you get this process. Bishops become much more politically important than they were before. Not only is it legal for them to exist, but they've been given imperial sanction. They can start to take action and move like politically empowered figures. You have to worry about what the bishop thinks of you all of a sudden in town. It's not somebody you can ignore. It's somebody you have to get the support of and work with if you want to be politically successful. They're making court decisions that have the force of law. They are able to move around in such a way that they become very important. And the structure of the church becomes more rigid as well. And the more important they get, the more restrictive they are about who gets to count as kind of members of the church administration. Whereas back in the days of the 3rd century, you had a fair number of women who were serving as deaconesses, who were providing ministerial positions and helping teach and instruct new members, and generally had important acknowledged roles in the early church. It was very often women who were patrons of the early church, who were using their money and support to help and keep alive Christians who wanted to be not arrested and to be able to continue doing their Christian tasks of various types and supporting widows and orphans. It was rich widows often who provided the money to support the poor widows. Those people are increasingly going to get squeezed out. The more power the church actually has, the more they turn to kind of traditional avenues of choosing who's going to get to express that power. Bishops come from more powerful families. Wealth is consolidated. There begins to be less of the more radical notions of Christianity being something that is going to overturn the basic I guess, assumptions about society. If you look at early Christian doctrine that gets emphasized, there's a lot of talk about how the last shall be first, how people should give away their wealth, how you should turn your back on kind of the more traditional ways of living your life and dedicate yourself to spirituality. And a lot of that starts to not be that prevalent anymore. Instead, there's an emphasis on a more conservative approach of still keeping traditional Roman family values in place, and reinforcing them within the kind of overarching structure of the church. There's also, and Eusebius is an excellent example of this from the 4th century, a great wave of Christian triumphalism. Bishops begin really writing essays and papers and all kinds of sermons about how this was all destined, that the unification of the Roman Empire and the Christian church was something that's the will of God, that what God is doing is he's using the Roman emperor and empire to create a world where Christianity is the religion and everybody is going to be it. And they're going to work toward that somewhat actively. Christianity will be promoted. When Constantine takes over, he only makes it legal. He doesn't make it necessary to be Christian, but he gives a lot of favor to Christians. And anybody who might have been thinking about it is going to kind of join on the bandwagon. And Christianity will expand really rapidly after that. It doesn't take long before Christianity will be the official religion of the Roman Empire. And this has both advantages and disadvantages for the people living in the empire at the time. It has advantages and disadvantages to the church. And one of the effects, whether you see it as an advantage or a disadvantage, is that with the infusion of a bunch of people who are jumping on the bandwagon, it dilutes in some ways the aspects of Christian faith that made it different from other forms of religion in the ancient world. They don't ever quite give up the whole monotheism thing, but a lot of the more radical stuff gets watered down. You have a lot of people joining Christianity because it's seen as a mainstream thing to do. Well, they want mainstream ideas. They don't want to all become radicals overnight. Okay, so moving on. That being said, there are still people who are quite disappointed that they missed their chance to be martyrs. If you remember, if you wanted to be a martyr while Diocletian was in charge, simple. All you had to do was go down and surrender yourself as a Christian. And people did do this. And then refuse to relent, and then you get executed for being a Christian, because that's how it worked. Well, after Christianity is legalized, you can't do that anymore because the emperor is not arresting Christians and he's not killing any Christians. And so what are you going to do? How can you become a martyr? There's all these stories about martyrs being great heroes. What if you too wanted to be a martyr and now you've lost your opportunity? I say this sort of facetiously, but it was a serious phenomenon in the 4th and 5th centuries. So what happens in some cases is that Christians begin becoming increasingly antagonistic to people who are not Christian. So, for instance, Bishop Theophilus goes to a temple to Serapis. Serapis is another one of those mystery religions, in fact. He goes to a temple of Serapis and knocks over the statue and confronts everybody who's in there. And he's like, your God is a false god or a demon or something. Most of the time when Christians attack other religions, they do not imply that the other gods aren't real, or that magic isn't real, or any of the other things are sort of forbidden to indulge in. They don't ever imply that these things don't exist or that they're not real. They'll say that you shouldn't worship Isis or Serapis or Mithras or Mars or Zeus or whoever it is you're worshiping. Not because Zeus doesn't exist, but because Zeus is actually a demon and worshiping him is wrong and bad. So everyone knows magic works in this world, but don't do it because it's sinful. That's the impression. That's the emphasis. That's the tack that Christians take. And so Theophilus, among others, will go into these shrines, kick over images of the gods, and say, look, I didn't get struck down from on high. Your God is powerless compared to mine. You're actually worshiping a demon. You should stop doing that and do what I say instead. As you can imagine, this offends people. And it is possible that you'll be attacked, probably you'll be attacked, and possibly you may be killed doing this kind of thing. After they are, in many Christian communities, people who get killed doing this sort of thing end up being proclaimed as martyrs. There is a bit of pushback against that, where you have other Christian thinkers who are like, no, you can't just provoke people into killing you and then claim to be a martyr. That's ridiculous. But nevertheless, this is one of the things that happens. In places where Christianity gains primacy, what will happen sometimes is that images that are thought to depict gods. Now, in this case, it's probably a mistake. This is probably Augustus, although the emperors were sometimes sort of worshipped. They're never proclaimed gods like the pharaohs are, but as part of a kind of public indication of your loyalty, people would be asked to burn some incense in front of an image of the emperor to pray for the emperor's genius. Sometimes emperors will declare that their predecessors, never themselves while they're alive, but that their predecessors after death have apotheosized or sort of been raised in some form or another to the heavens. And so are therefore their spirit is looking out for Rome from beyond the grave. It's kind of a half ghost, half god, if you will. But so it's possible that that was the thought process here. This is almost certainly an image of Augustus. And when pagan temples are destroyed by Christians, they're a little leery of statues of the gods, many of which in the ancient world were thought to have actual powers or to be vessels through which the spirit of the god might look or otherwise kind of appear. And so these statues would be destroyed, literally defaced. That's what it would mean, where the face would be damaged. You can see poor Augustus here had his nose broken. And then very often, just for extra insurance, you can see the cross carved on his head. They'd carve a cross on them and bury them upside down. So, you know. So that's how that went. Alrighty, so how does this go down? Constantine is going to give favor to Christianity. It's going to spread. He's going to have kind of a long reign, which is a big part of why he succeeds. Just like Augustus back in the day, Constantine is going to have more than 20 years as emperor. He's going to rule the entire empire. He's going to kind of pull it back together, at least temporarily, though that split between East and West never really entirely goes away. He's going to rule the whole thing for a while. And then he's going to have kind of a messy family situation to deal with. Constantine will convert to Christianity on his deathbed and be baptized. During his 20-year reign, he had deliberately chosen as his successors people who were Christian. He'd surrounded himself with Christian. His family, he demanded that they be Christian if they wanted to be considered eligible for succession. Constantine had also had some, well, say unpleasantness. He'd had some sons that caused some problems. His eldest son in particular, he has executed without any explanation, kind of overnight, never says anything about why. He also has his wife executed overnight, never says why. He's likely uncovered a plot, or they were sleeping together or something, no one really knows. There was rebellions he had to put down, a whole bunch of family members he had to have killed. And so Constantine, on the one hand, had espoused Christianity, on the other hand, had killed a lot of his family. Julian, who is his nephew, his brother's son, survives this. He was forced to adopt Christianity in his youth in order to please his uncle, who might otherwise murder him, I guess. And he was so traumatized by the experience that when he reaches adulthood, Constantine dies, and there's a bunch of civil war, and eventually in 361, after all of the sons of Constantine are dead, the throne passes to Julian. And Julian was so freaked out by the whole, like, being forced to be Christian during his youth and then, you know, pretend later on in life, and his family all murdering everybody else in the family, and it's just general violence. He has nothing but contempt for Christianity. He's like, this is all just, I'm not doing it. And so when he becomes the emperor, he's like, we're not doing, we started this whole Christian thing. We've had like 20 years. We're turning back the clock. We're giving it up. We're not doing it anymore. And so he tries to turn back the clock. He's like, let's just go back to Roman religion, but not the old Roman religion. Let's infuse it with philosophy and go to some kind of this new hybrid thing that I've thought of. It goes over like a lead balloon. Everybody laughs at him. They're like, Julian, you can't just make up a religion. We're not doing that. The whole Christian thing is also, it's deeply entrenched at this point. All these churches have money. They've been empowered, and they're part of providing governmental services. We're not giving it up. And he was so bitter about this that he writes a book called the Misopogon, which means beard hater, because he grows the beard to indicate he's a philosopher. And he was made fun of and mocked for doing it. And so he writes this kind of whiny book about how people are mean to him because he's a philosopher. It's just bad. But he only rules 18 months. If he'd managed to stick it out, if he'd survived, he dies in battle. If he survived and had ruled for 20 years, perhaps he would have had his way. He might have reversed the changes that made Christianity the official religion of the empire. It's possible he could have, but that's not what was fated to be. He dies in battle, and the emperors who take over after him are going to keep rolling with Christianity. And it's going to create a very messy and yet very powerful union between this religious movement and this political juggernaut of an institution that is the Roman Empire. Now, all of that is going to come under serious challenge next lecture. We're going to talk about how the western part of the Roman Empire starts experiencing increasing political pressures that will result in them ultimately falling away from the eastern half. So that will be next time. Thanks a lot. Bye.